Welcome to the community. It's great to have you here on this Territory 3 webinar with Emily Mason. I'm really excited to have Emily here today. Emily and I have known each other for some time, and I've had the privilege of actually seeing Emily make the transition from public servant at a very high level and move into the founder world, both from a services point of view and a technology point of view. So Emily, welcome. It's fantastic to have you here.
Hello, John.
And as always, I'm going to kick off and just get you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, morena koutou, ko Emily Mason, taka wangua. It's Māori Language Week, and it's great to be with you. My name's Emily Mason, and I am Chief Executive and Founder at a services organisation called FrankAdvice, and co-founder with some other remarkable people at an organisation called Impact Lab, where I currently serve as Director and on the board. So a little bit about me. As John mentioned, I spent more than 20 years serving New Zealand in the public service, and really honed my interest in how do we make better decisions? What is the decision-making infrastructure that we need in order to make good decisions every time, or the best decisions that we can every time, to serve New Zealand well. And about 3.5 years ago now, I stepped out of the public service into the private sector and established both FrankAdvice and Impact Lab in the same 6-month period. Not sure I would recommend that in hindsight, but they are both really focused on almost a B2B offer. How do organisations that want to create great impact, one, have the processes and disciplines and thoughtfulness, critical rigour in place to support them to make those great decisions using words, and secondly, how do they know where to put their efforts so that their efforts are aimed at creating the greatest impact that they can? So you're focusing on both how you do it, but focusing your efforts on what is best for making it the best change for New Zealand. So yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. And, you know, just interested in your thought, and folks, just a bit of housekeeping. So a lot of you will be very familiar nowadays with the Zoom format, but there is the ability to ask questions. We love to have an interactive session with these webinars. So
please do ask.
Yeah, absolutely. So all I'd ask is if you could put those in the Q&A section. You'll see a comments button or a chat side to your Zoom interface, and you'll also see Q&A. Just much easier for us to make sure we get through all those questions. We'll probably take a little break about half an hour in to answer those questions, and then another one just before we finish to try and make sure that we get through as much of the things that are on people who are watching this as mind. So thanks for the intro, Emily. And I mean, you know, public servant to founder, anything immediately come to mind as the most challenging thing around making that transition?
So it's always somebody else's budget in the public service, and working for a large organisation. So one, what somebody else's budget means doesn't mean that you can be more reckless with that money, but it does mean there's a little bit more flex and a little bit a longer feedback loop. So the feedback loop is much tighter in the private sector than it is in the public service in terms of the quality of the work you do and the value of it to your clients. So we very quickly learned in the public service that very quickly in the private sector, what did I have business doing business in, and really honing that product market fit. And I think in the public sector, there's not that feedback loop nearly as tightly. So you are serving both ministers who are elected and serving New Zealand, and you are serving New Zealand directly as well. So you can have a bit of a split customer base, I guess, in private sector speak. So that's one of the challenges. The other challenge I really found is that in the end, FrankAdvice, particularly because it's just me, but also Impact Lab is my baby. Nobody else cares about what I am doing and how well I am doing it as I do. So I have to be very, very passionate and motivated every day. That has to come from an internal motivation to, I want to serve New Zealand better through better decisions, and bringing back every decision to that when the going gets tough is really important in the private sector, because there is no one to tell me that I'm doing a good job. There's no one to do a performance review for me. There's no minister sitting there saying, well done, let's keep going. It's all on me. So I think kind of one of those, that's probably the biggest challenge, in terms of the shift. The other one that kind of comes to mind is that the public service are large, mature organisations with a nice defined purpose. I went to work for the public service because I wanted to put my efforts into supporting New Zealand to be a great place to be. And in the private sector, it's many more smaller organisations. And in my world, what that meant for hiring is that the jobs are very specific roles that I need. And whereas in the public sector, I could hire great people and fit them to a range of roles because there's so many roles available. Whereas in Founderland, there's less scope for that. So
totally.
Recruitment practices had to change a bit too, I think.
Totally. And, sort of moving on from that around, this word impact. I really want to spend some time on this for a couple of reasons. One is that in the reimagination of Kiwi Landing Pad, now we're sitting here as Territory 3. One of the things we wanted to do from a founder perspective is become much more inclusive to impact founders. So people working on projects that are not necessarily for profit, not even necessarily for globalisation. So that's sort of one aspect. And the second is even coming back to those ventures and founders working on for-profit, heavy activities. This concept of impact is, quite refreshingly, from certainly my point of view, coming into even those decisions. We're seeing investors actually have diligence elements of how purposeful or how socially and environmentally responsible startups are before they invest money, which traditionally was, always purely a pure capitalist sort of view, or a narrow capitalist sort of view. So
shareholder return kind of view.
Well, yes, singular shareholder return being more cash. So for you, with your deep experience, what is impact, and why is it increasingly important in those two contexts from your point?
Yeah, great. So I'll talk first I'll talk about a little bit about what is impact. So I'm quite definitive and disciplined about what I think impact means. So what all of the work that I do supports is around improving outcomes. So outcomes are improved experience, life experience, lived experience of people. It's about people for me particularly. Does apply to the environment, but my career has really focused on the people-centered policy area. So how do we improve outcomes for New Zealanders, whether that be, this government talks about well-being, and we've become much more nuanced about well-being. Well-being has kind of two components. It's individual well-being and all of, the physical, mental, spiritual aspects of that, economic aspects of that as individuals, but it's also that there's also a component of equity, so that how do we improve outcomes equitably for New Zealand? It's really great to see this discussion about COVID, about people getting vaccinated, so Māori and Pacific communities in particular, being equitably vaccinated rather than just a global vaccination number. So we can see that idea of well-being coming through in an equitable sense as well. And those ideas about well-being are also, we have a shared societal view, I think, and we also have a I can't tell you, John, what specifically well-being looks like for you, but there's both dimensions to that. But then, so if we think about that being the outcome we want to achieve, and how do we use both words and numbers to understand that, then underneath that is impact. So impact is how do we measure the value of that outcome when we achieve it or not. So if, as organisations, we invest in supporting young people to become more educated, if we're a bank that supports people to access capital, not at the rapacious rates that the loan sharks do, but at the rates that are more fairer rates. What is the outcome that creates? It creates financial stability. What is the value of that financial stability in both dollars and in words? That's the impact. How do we describe that impact that financial stability has on people's well-being? And we can measure that impact using numbers, and we can describe it quite tightly using words. And then actually, to go one step further, there are also processes and methodologies that we can use to do that in a replicable and repeatable way. That means that we can compare impacts across a range of domains, so that we then know where to best put our efforts to have the best impact on people's well-being. So it's a very, it's quite a nerdy way to approach it, but it's a very disciplined and logical and replicable and repeatable and scalable approach to understanding impact and understanding well-being. And then, so what does that do? That then lets us work with all sorts of organisations where they can bring their passion and their content, and we can help them structure that words-based and numbers-based decision-making so they can create the most impact that they can in the area that they're passionate about. Yeah, so that's the impact side. In the terms of this other part of your question, it was about, I think we don't have to distinguish between the for-profit and the not-for-profit sector. The only way that kind of plays out is that one makes a profit and one should make a surplus. Right. So I absolutely think that for-profit organisations can have a positive impact on the world, and that sharpness of focus about using profit for purpose, I guess, or Rod Drury talks about no margin, no mission. That you can do both at the same time, and I think that it's what you see, what I see. So I've worked across probably a dozen public sector organisations, maybe 50 to 100 not-for-profit organisations, and then with a handful of for-profit organisations over the last 5 or 6 years. And what we see is that in the for-profit sector, there is investment in understanding R&D to have greater impact. And when we talk about the not-for-profit sector, they're often just focused on just enough money to deliver, but not to innovate and improve in their ability to create impact. So I actually think that some of those that investment in improvement that we would do in the private sector to stay ahead of the curve and keep meeting the market need is something that we don't often think about in the private sector, in the NGO sector, and it harms them. It doesn't, they're so innovative. There's not a single founder in the not-for-profit sector that isn't motivated to do the best thing they can do for the not-for-profit area that they've decided to go into. Because they've decided to go into it in spite of the dollars, not because of them. And I think I think there's quite a lot that the private or the for-profit sector can learn from the NGO sector, and there's quite a lot of investment that goes into the private sector and understanding impact that is withheld from the NGO sector.
Yeah,
so they don't.
That makes sense, and it sort of leads me to another question, because I guess thinking about this impact piece in the pure sort of traditional view, or traditional in a lot of people's minds view of a founder, which is, a tech company or something like that, trying to get a new solution to a big problem in the world. Yeah. And of course, a lot of that is pre-revenue. So, and needs to be funded. So, a lot of us as founders have experienced a scenario where for the first 1 or 2 years, there's not much revenue to keep investors happy about whether we're actually making progress.
Whether anybody wants you or not.
Yeah, that's right. But it's all down to the metrics that indicate that you're actually making some degree of impact into this market that you're trying to access, and the traditional ones are like, the prospect list is growing, or the number of positive, potential customer engagements you've had where they've said, yes, we would buy this if you, spend some more money on building some functions or features. But can you give us some, I guess, where I'm getting to is that it all comes down, and I'm happy to be disproved on this with your view, is like to data. And turning that into the metrics that matter at the time, which, coming back to the first piece was are not going to be, we doubled our revenue per month. That's those engagement things. Could you give us some examples or just thoughts around those metrics in terms of how they play out, and I guess maybe some of the more memorable to you about impact metrics that are not around the profit side of things, more about the things you've talked about?
Yeah, sure. So impact metrics, so for impact focused businesses. So I think it's really important to look at, if you are a business that is supporting supporting people to get back to work. There's things around who are those people? They're not your customers in the traditional sense, but they are your customers because you want to solve a problem for them and serve them, solve a problem for them, and add value to their lives, right? So if you've defined that group as people who need support to return to work, who are you really working with? Whether you are working with those people who are have just lost their jobs, for example, who are going to be much easier to connect to the back to the employment market, or are you working with people who have been in jail for 10 years and are coming out of jail and actually going to need much more support, not only to find a job but to stay connected to that job? So as an investor, if I was investing in an organisation that was looking to have impact to support people to be employed, I would be looking for, did I not only are you finding the right people first, and can you define that? Can you say, yes, those people have just lost their jobs, or people who are really being much less well served previously? And how sticky are they in the business lingo? So kind of the conceptual ideas are the same, but I'd be looking for, what is the outcome that you care about? Is it better education? Is it more financial stability? Is it more employment stability? Is it keeping the environment clean? Is it keeping people well housed? That's a really topical one in New Zealand. And then once you've got that outcome sorted, look to the data to measure that. And the data can be, it's understanding the baseline. So were these people housed before or not? Were they in education before or not? How likely were they to succeed without you? That's one really crucial question, because it's very easy to go and say, 80% of people in New Zealand have been vaccinated, but actually 75% of them were going to go and get vaccinated anyway.
Right.
So if you're looking for impact, the impact is for the marginal improvement, not that 5%. How do we get the most out of that 5%? So in terms of data sources, there is plenty of data around in New Zealand. In fact, we are one of the most data-rich, in the social sector, data-rich countries in the world. The Stats New Zealand do an amazing job to create this data taonga, as I tend to think about it. What does that mean? Go to the Treasury's website, it's called the CBAX tool, CBAX, where they have a whole list of impacts and the dollar values of those. You can work with organisations like Impact Lab, who'll do you a bespoke one with the government's data behind the hood. You can go to Figure NZ. So Figure NZ, Lily and Grace is the founder there, that she puts a wealth of data in a usable form that's already in the public domain, but she's packaged it up in a way that makes it way more usable than it otherwise would be. Use the data that you've got. Tell people the data that you're using. If people do have specific questions on this, actually feel very free to email me, and I can point you in the right direction pretty quickly. Cool. So use the data that you've got and think about how it could be improved, and tell the people who are producing that data what improvements you would like to see. Because Stats New Zealand, for example, have the data ventures part of their business, which is looking to serve New Zealanders better, but they aren't often told what would be more useful. So, you know, as if you are an impact founder, think about what are the outcomes that you want to achieve. And I would push that a really long way. We want people to have better lives. What does that mean? It means more people need to be educated, more people need to be housed, more people need to be in gainful employment. What does that mean? It means we're going to focus on people moving from NCEA 1 to NCEA 2 into a sustainable employment trajectory. And this is where we're going to intervene. Now, that's the outcome. What is the measure? We're going to measure the number of people that we work with that didn't previously get qualified and now have. That didn't previously, and then you can say 10 people, 50 people, 100 people, and then you can say, and because of that, they went into sustainable employment, and the average wage is, whatever the average wage is in New Zealand, probably around $60,000. I'm not quite sure on that one. And so they're earning $60,000 that they previously wouldn't have. They are not receiving the benefit that they previously wouldn't have. You can start to put together a logical impact measure that talks to your investors, because they can then see what is not only, so then they can start to compare the benefits that we're creating for New Zealand to the costs of investing in this. So it's a pretty controversial view, but my view is that we should push as hard as we can to measure impacts in dollars. Not because money is everything, because it's not, but because we understand money as a way of valuing relative impacts. We do that when we decide to buy a coffee rather than save our money. We do that when we decide to go out for dinner rather than go to McDonald's. So we're actually used to making these trade-offs as using money as a benchmark, as a ranking system. So, and I think we can do that to measure impact, the good we create in a non-fiscal sense, as well as the good we create in terms of shareholder value, dollar value.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess if I play that back, really, you're essentially still, the principles are the same, it would seem to me. You're building a pipeline of the people, just come out of prison or are unemployed. You're qualifying that they're the right people. You're then applying your solution to the problem that, you want to get most of them or as many of them employed again. And you're just kind of refining the priorities using a metric like dollars, which is well understood, because, governments, just as startups, there is only so much money that can be around. And if you don't have a singular metric, you can't sort of make a list of, well, what we can or can't do and what would be most impactful. Is that kind of the...
And for large corporates, it's the same, right? They've still got to decide where to put their pro bono effort. And they should be putting that where it's going to make the biggest difference for New Zealand. And so to do that, they need to have a ranking scale to be able to make those decisions. So,
and the same for startups.
Yeah, the other thing I would say, it's a challenge to funders, I think, or investors. Need is not a bell curve. So you can't, for those who are have been least well served by New Zealand, there is the investment that is required to support them is twice as much as the people at the next point on the curve, as people on the next point of the curve. So you can't make an incremental investment according to need. You need to, those who are most in need of support or have been least well served by society require, in an order of magnitude, a different quantum of investment to improve their lives, to achieve those outcomes. Then the 80% of people are the same, and they can have a light touch, small investment to improve their odds of achieving that outcome. Then once people really, so those who have come out of prison for 10 years, they will need, on average, twice as much investment as the people who have been in prison for a shorter amount of time, those people will need twice as much investment as people who are just on the edge of getting into trouble, who will need twice as much investment as people who haven't been in touch with the law.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's a hockey stick. So if you think about in the corporate sector, when you're going for investment, and you're like, we'll go slow, and then we'll have this hockey stick of scale. It actually looks like that for need as well. So
right.
So if you're looking to make a difference for impact, you're going to have, and you're working with those who are least well served by New Zealand, you're going to have to invest as heavily as you would in that early stage development to get that scale piece.
So I guess
a few numbers around that.
Yeah.
In terms of the government's budget, 85% of people, 15%, do it the other way around, 15% of people receive 50% of the government's investment.
Right.
Because we don't serve them well, and we're serving them up lots of, they need the bespoke, intensive investment rather than the light touch for everybody. So I think in terms of if you are investing for impact, expect to spend at the high end of the J curve rather than a little bit for everybody, because that just doesn't work.
And I imagine that obviously has an impact on another metric or factor, which is time, right? Time to impact.
Time to impact. Yeah. And the literature there will tell you that, so if social problems were easy, we would have solved them, right? And actually we see ourselves going backwards. And on some metrics, not on all, to be fair. So the literature says kind of at least 6 years, to be able to see shifts in particular areas. Saying that, that's you can keep feeding misery, or you can intervene and give it exactly what's needed.
Yeah.
To make that shift. Yes,
and that a reflection on that for the last day or so for me, just doing office hours down here in Christchurch, is a number of discussions around how much money you should try and raise to be correlated to what's a meaningful result you could get from that.
That's right.
And the traditional, way as founders, because of the impacts on dilution as a shareholder and those things.
Hold it tight
and potentially raise, not enough to actually have the impact, or in the time frame that basically that money allows you to do it. So it seems like some parallels there, right?
Yeah, we see that all the time. The other thing I would say there is that if you are working in the impact space, are you doing it to be seen to do good, or are you doing it to actually do good?
Right.
So and that if you are actually doing good takes more time and more money for those people who have least been well served than you will expect. Whereas if you just want to do a little bit of good as an adjunct to your business, that's a different kettle. That's much cheaper and easier, quite frankly, but much less impactful.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Someone said impact vampires are all over the place.
Impact vampires.
Thanks, Joe.
I like that. We'll take some questions shortly, but just before we do that, and I don't mean to keep coming back to public sector, private sector, but it is a bit of a fascination for me, and I'm sure a lot of our community have never really worked or got an opportunity to have a deep understanding of the public sector versus private. So this question really is around, what are your views on what you've brought from your public sector experience to your founder career that have served you well or given you some interesting perspective on it?
Yeah, good question. So I don't come from an entrepreneurial background. So my parents have, I come from a family that's always worked for other people or been teachers or, architects kind of thing. So it was, I guess I really had a big blind spot for what I didn't know. And it's taken me kind of the 3 years to reflect on the pieces that have served me well from the public service. One would be the opportunity to learn, and this whole thing about what is impact, what are outcomes, what is the decision making infrastructure that's needed to make great decisions at scale. Because what government is good at doing is delivering things at scale to a mass market, right? Like, what it is not good at doing is honing what's needed for that top of the J curve for those who are most in need. So so working for large, mature organisations and then leading large, mature organisations, I think, through my 30s was a real opportunity. And I guess learning about, because the public service doesn't have that really hard-nosed shareholder return metric, dollar profit, value, like, I didn't even know that EBITDA was a thing until I started my own business. The naivety surprises me. But what that taught me is that the importance of people doing business with people, because you can only get business done in the public sector if people think you're credible and if they like you. Right. So there's a book called Never Eat Alone. My version of it is never have a cup of tea on your own, always make a pot of tea rather than a cup of tea, and spend time with people. And one of my mentors, who might be on this call, came on, said to me, I was whinging when I went into the private sector that people wouldn't get to the business end quickly enough. I'd come, like, time is money, we'll go with an idea for a deal we can do, and they'd want to talk about the weather or whatever, or something entirely unrelated to what I was interested in. And I think I really missed a few tricks in my early days because I didn't appreciate that in working for myself and setting up businesses, that go into every meeting seeking to understand what the other person is interested in first and foremost. Yeah. And then if it's not what you can offer them, fine, what can you learn from them? And so really treating, I think what I learned in the public service is that getting to know what makes other people tick is so important. And in the public service, you've got the time and opportunity to learn that in a way that maybe in the private sector, when you've got these KPIs and metrics, that you just don't have the time because the profit margin's so often so tight. Yeah. Yeah. That would probably be it. The importance of purpose and impact. Like, I think when we met, John, and you were just really interested in that, and I just couldn't get my head around why this was novel. Yeah. My driving force is to support individuals and particular causes to do the best they could and have the greatest impact that they could. But now it's doing it one person and one idea at a time is not good enough. We're never going to sort the problems and the opportunities of the world if we deal with them one organisation and one problem at a time. But we can do that by having frameworks that drive that thinking, so that the content and the intellect and the integrity can really can happen at pace, and so the public service spends a lot of time innovating those frameworks, and I guess that's the other thing that I learned in the public service. What are the kinds of conceptual problems that we have that we can see when we look at things at scale, like, is this the kind of problem that is best served through a information campaign, Or is it the kind of problem that's best served by requiring our staff or our people to behave a kind of way? Or is it best served by dealing with it piece by piece by piece, And how do we, having the opportunity to do those kind of things in the public service time and time again, so that now I can pick the right one.
Yeah,
that was really helpful. I got a lot of time working with very senior people, ever from being 21 and 22. I was meeting with the Minister for Education at that time. I've met, I think, all of the last 4 prime ministers, that kind of mentorship and insight to how do senior decision makers make decisions, I think was an amazing privilege, and really something that's so how can you learn from that in the private sector? Mentor your staff like that. Take them along to those meetings. You can tell them, don't say anything, but observe. And just that opportunity, I think, was really, really helpful. Yeah,
no, that's very cool and makes total sense. And I think somebody in the comments threw out the word empathy, and to your point about, cutting to the chase sometimes, because, we do recognise time as the most precious asset, but sometimes it's about people sort of, the woman Esther Perel, she talks a lot about psychological safety and how important it is to establish that before you actually get a decent conversation. I mean, that's in a business
100%.
relationship.
So maybe we can talk a bit about that too. So we, at FrankAdvice in particular, I relative to other small organisations, so we're 11 staff now, I've over-invested in our values practice.
Yeah.
And that is, at its heart, it creates the psychological safety for my diverse team. So they don't look diverse, but I've recruited for a diversity of skill set and way of thinking, and we profile for that. We use the data to understand that, to create the psychological safety for people who are different to bring their views to the table. And as the leader and the founder, that's exhausting, right? Because I have people interacting with me who, honestly, I just don't get them. That it makes for a better business and it makes for a better decision. But everyone talks about that, but they don't talk about the energy that's required to sometimes literally take a deep breath and think, they're coming from a different perspective, I need to hear that. And then you need to be able to have the processes and disciplines in place so that the whole team build their muscle to be able to be psychologically safe, right? Because values practice and working well with people who aren't like you takes a muscle that most of us don't grow very well. We have friends who are like us. We have, and when we live in urban centres in particular, I think people who come from small towns are much better at it, because they have to go to school with people, they have to work with people who they don't like very much, but they have to all rub along together. Whereas if we work for big organisations and we come from big schools and big communities, we find our tribe, and that so we have rituals and practices that make it easier for us to have those, to bring the diversity of thought to our discussions, because the framework is safe. It's a safe place to be.
No, that's great. And I know just from some of the comments, people are getting a lot of value out of just articulating that, because it's often just, washed over in terms of, values done on a sheet.
Anything you think it happens, right? So just for those of you who are interested, so in my team of 11, we have somebody who spends about a day and a half to 2 days a week just working on our values practice and figuring out what that looks like. We invest in a strengths coach as part of that practice. We've articulated for both our clients and our customers and ourselves internally, what do each of our values look like and what are the behaviours that are associated with them and what are the edges of them. And we've done that as a team. And we have a half an hour team slot every week where we come together and we've been posed a question 2 or 3 days before, and we come and reflect on what does that mean. So this morning's question was about, we've got 4 values: patience, rigour, kindness and generosity. And what does that mean in terms of which one speaks to us individually in terms of the individual strengths that we bring and how we do our job every day. So it's very business focused. It's not soft at all. It's very much about being a great team and doing a great job, but it's very, it's how do our values translate into our practices that we see every day. So I think it probably, like, you know, it doesn't make sense on the bottom line, but it makes sense in terms of the impact that the organisation will have and our ability to work with, to meet our clients where they are, because we have that resilience. Well, we're building that resilience to understand each other when we're different. Yeah, and it's a magnet too. I know, you know, I've served on one of your interview panels, and I've seen, you know, the people that have been attracted to your organisation, and I've heard them articulate that, you know, what they've heard in the marketplace about the values and sort of what it's like to work at Frank. It is a big part of why they turned up, which is just phenomenal. And it doesn't avoid the hard conversations, so I'll just be really clear about that. Like so what I like about particularly about the name FrankAdvice is that we talk about what does Frank need. So it's also not an individual expression of the values, it's a collective expression for the purposes of the business. So it does mean that sometimes we have to make hard decisions about where do we put our efforts, but we can still do that in a values-based way. And, you know, to be fair, it's much easier to talk about than it is to do. So it is something that I'm learning every day, you know.
As always. We're going to take a break, and I do want to come back to some of that cultural piece, but we've got some questions here, and the first one is definitely one that I'm interested in your view on. It's from anonymous attendee, and who almost always attends our webinars. Thank you, anonymous. What are your thoughts on the sheer number of not-for-profits who often overlap? And do you think there should be some sort of consolidation to maximise the impact and the dollars invested?
Yes. That is also not a very popular opinion, but I do think there are too many not-for-profits in New Zealand focusing on often competing for the same dollar, and often that you know, if you have 6 chief executives when you could have 1, if you have 3 administrators when you could have 1, you know, that's money that's not going to have the greatest impact. It's going, because there are business costs regardless of, you know, it costs money to do business regardless of what business you do. So if you can make those as efficient as possible, so as much of the money can be going to doing good, I think that's important. I do think there's a recognition of that in philanthropy at the moment. So you were seeing some talk. Philanthropy New Zealand, for example, has just launched Match, which is kind of improving some of that efficiency. And I think the next step on that kind of work is to start to look for partnerships between NGOs who can deliver well together. And then you'll see the next step of that being an integration, you know, like that's the ideal step. I do think a monopoly isn't a great thing either. So we wouldn't want to go too far on that view. But I do think having a understanding the landscape of who is serving, which NGOs are serving which communities for which outcomes first would be really great, and then what impact are they having, also really great. And if, you know, that's part of my motivation for co-founding Impact Lab, was to start to create a map of the NGOs that are working across New Zealand to create a better New Zealand, because they all do, right? They all are motivated. Like one of the first people that we worked for was Verna at Pillars, and so Pillars work with children who've come out of children whose parents are in prison, you know, and for 30 years she got out of bed to help those kids feel better, be better while they were in these really challenging circumstances, you know. And Libby at Family Help Trust, another small outfit in Christchurch, same thing. How do I support these people, women who are having children in very challenging circumstances, to overcome what's in front of them, you know? And I would never want to say, Libby and Verna, you need to go head to head because they are both motivated and the need is so great.
Yeah.
You know, it's how do we as a system get the best out of that need? And that's not about talking about it, it's about getting together and serving those people where our skill sets sit. And that's about understanding who do we serve, how effective is the service we give them, and there's plenty of evidence around what works and what doesn't for different populations, and then what's the value of the change we create.
Yeah,
and how do we do that? How do we rinse and repeat and do that every time? You know.
And I guess that's actually, I mean, the same question in the for-profit is, you know, why are there so many email clients or messaging services? It's really about, you know, they get momentum, they obviously solve a problem for a section of, you know, very big market or very big element of need, right?
Yeah.
Max Voskov is asked, if the mission for a for-profit business is to serve a certain community, how much profit is too much? And what's the way to find it out without alienating the community? What a great question.
What a great question. Thanks, Max. So I think about that in terms of social license. So, you know, consumers are really savvy these days. You know, they can spot a purpose washing, you know, a mile away. And so you'll see some of those big four NGOs who have started doing or have always done pro bono work for Māori communities, for example, specific Māori communities, and you're getting a real lot of backlash against that because those tech communities, Māori tech communities in particular that I'm talking about, know that those for-profit businesses are only doing it. They feel like they're only doing it to improve their reputation. They're not doing it for the value of those communities.
Mm.
So whether that's, I'm not making a judgment about whether that's true or not, because some of those big for-profit consultancies are doing a great job at internalizing the change that's needed, you know, and you're seeing that quite fast. So so how much profit is too much profit? It's not too much profit, it's how much good you are doing and how much value you are creating for those communities, and whether they see that trade-off as an okay one to make. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question. Come back and ask it again, Max, if you want me to go a bit harder on it.
Yeah, the big one that should be constantly asked, I think. But Anna Gunther, hi Anna. Hey Emily, what's exciting you the most in the social impact space at the moment? And what are the biggest challenges that you see?
What's exciting me the most in the social impact space? So I think, I mean, maybe this is my journey. I am really focused so one of my biggest challenges in the first 3 years has been being attracted to every shiny idea. That's every possibility, rather than the kind of hard yards for the discipline, right? So that's required to action on those shiny ideas. So everybody has great ideas. The discipline for me is doing the everyday grunt work to make sure that those ideas come to fruition. So I think we've actually had a period of amazing innovation and opportunity in the social impact sector, particularly around measuring impact. So two things: one, measuring impact, and two, putting in the words side of it, putting in place the frameworks that are required to make great decisions and practicing those disciplines that come with those frameworks every time you have a decision to make. So what's the opportunity, Anna? I think it's probably to take what we learn from Git flow or software development in the tech sector and replicating that, and how do we make decisions in communities so that we're making the decision-making process as frictionless as possible, so that we can really focus on the quality of the decision that we're making to have the best impact that we can. So that's a bit esoteric, but it's an infrastructural, and we're starting to see a system-wide or an infrastructural improvement rather than a bespoke point-by-point solution process. And Anna, that's your bread and butter. So probably I've learned more from you and those like you than that's the opportunity in the social sector to take some of those learnings about tech at scale to use those disciplines for good in the social sector, so we can really focus on the good rather than the processes for raising the money or making the decision, or those things can happen much more quickly and we can get on with the doing.
Yeah.
So not very sexy, but it's the difference between running a half marathon or a marathon once and being able to get up the next morning and do it again in a month's time.
Yeah, makes sense. From Jackie, kia ora Jackie. Emily, thanks for those insights. Could you please give us an example of a successful benefit to cost measure that was convincing to an investor that you've come across recently?
Yeah, sure. So, Jackie, if you're interested in this question in particular, I really recommend you get in touch with Maria at Impact Lab. She's the chief executive there. She's got lots of examples. If you Google Good Measure Impact Lab, you'll come up with about 3 pages of Google examples. But I'll talk to one in particular. So I'll talk to one that we did in the public service, and then I'll talk to one in the private sector. So in the public service, we looked at what's the impact on people's lives if you give them a house, if you put them into social housing, rather than them having transient or emergency housing, and what's the impact on education, welfare, and their justice experience. And what we found was that if you, this is not going to be a surprise to anybody, but if someone is coming out of prison and you give them a social house or a public house rather than leaving it to the market, then those people are much less likely to reoffend and much less likely to seriously reoffend. And that was saving the corrections department 25% of the money they were spending on that group of people. So what happened there is they then went to what was the Ministry of Social Development and worked with them to create a housing pathway so Ministry of Social Development and Corrections decided to invest in deliberately and intentionally housing people who were coming out of prison rather than leaving it to the market. So that's kind of a scale solution. We've also seen, Impact Lab, we've also seen organisations like Pacifica Futures, who work with a range of social sector Pacific organisations supporting Pacific communities, understand the social value across their organisations and how to, as a funder, best support them. We've got examples of organisations like Dewdrop. Dewdrop is a philanthropic foundation making decisions on who it invests in and how it funds based on the impact that a charity or an NGO is expected to have based on who they are working with, the quality of the intervention they're providing, and the cost of providing that intervention. So lots, actually. Yeah.
Very cool. We're going to take a break from questions, and Emily, hopefully you don't have a hard stop at 11. If you had a couple of minutes, what we might do.
One of the people I'm meeting with next is on the call, so she can chill for
there we go. For the person on the call, Emily's going to be slightly late.
Yeah.
And we'll come to Q&A because it's really important to us to get community questions answered. But there was a couple of aspects I wanted to make sure we covered in the hour, because I know a lot of people just block this out.
So maybe I can just pop. So Rebecca, yes, absolutely. You measure what matters, but you can't measure everything, and being really clear about where you can measure impact and where you can't. But so spiritual well-being, we can measure the social good that churches create by through food banks, for example, but we can't measure the spiritual improved support that my vicar gives me. So yeah, absolutely, and we don't try to do that. Yeah, so sorry, John, I'll pass back to you. That was just an easy one to cover.
No, nice work. Mental health, wellness, been a really interesting couple of years for everybody.
Yep.
But particularly if you're in a relatively new business,
or two.
or two. Thoughts to share about how you approach that aspect for you, because you can't look after others and lead others unless you're well yourself, right?
That's right. One of my favourite mentors too said, you can only lead people to where you are. Thanks, Elizabeth, from Hummingly for that. What would I say about that? I found the first lockdown really, really difficult. I was chief executive of Impact Lab and chief executive at FrankAdvice at the same time, both very early stage startups at that point, about a year in really. And I did not have the disciplines in place to help me through the crisis. Yep. So I found it really challenging, and it didn't take good care of my mental health. That ended up with some less than helpful behaviours on my side, I suspect. And in the interim kind of year since then, I've worked really hard to make sure I've got those mental health disciplines, practices in place that mean that this last lockdown has been much easier for me. Not straightforward, but much easier. So what does that mean? At work, I know what my runway looks like if we turn off the tap tomorrow and we don't have to shut the doors. I have a good relationship with my bank manager and a great overdraft facility, as well as the working capital, right? So those kind of financial things. I know in which order I will make the decisions that I need to make. So I've got a bit of a playbook for that stuff now. In terms of my own mental health, I run now. Running is quite a new thing to me. Call myself a hobby runner. I like to talk about it at least as much as I actually do it. And under lockdown, I ran every single day. So it wasn't a decision about whether I was going to exercise. It was when in my day will exercise. And I got to the end of the 3 weeks and I'd run 152 kilometres. So I listened to my body, but also the discipline was about staying physically well. And when I was faced with a challenge, I literally say to my team, I'm going for a run. I'll come back with a perspective. See you in an hour. And they know now, they can see that when I'm getting a bit frayed, they'll be like, go for a run. It's going to help you make that decision. And that's been really helpful. And it also probably, again, so I see a coach, she does, so depends what works for you. We do a range of things from role playing and rehearsing the challenging conversations or issues that are in my head through to relaxation hypnosis. So whatever I'm needing in order of keeping myself well. And I see her at least every month. And when it's tough going, I see her every fortnight. Yeah. So, and those are the things that I put in place post last lockdown. So I think what I would say to people who have struggled with this lockdown, or in general, don't try and put in those well-being disciplines while you're under pressure. The crisis is not the time for new habits. It's post-crisis, or when you have the time and energy to find new ways of being, that you can do that. When you're in crisis and you're struggling, the best thing you can do is be kind to yourself, which is not expect too much of yourself, actually. And then if you know you want to be different next time, use the quiet, the less intense time to practice those disciplines.
Yeah, no, great advice. Thanks for sharing that. Look, we've only got 2 or 3 minutes of the official time left, and then if we could whip through the questions. But my last piece always really is like, for the audience, your biggest learnings and I guess, your biggest challenges ahead as a founder, just sort of move to the wrap.
Yep. Challenges, sometimes I've employed people that I like rather than people that are right. Is probably how I would say that. And that the pace of the growth of both businesses has meant that the people that I have worked with, what the business has needed has changed so fast, and so people that grow with the business, it's really hard I find it really hard to say who that will be and who that won't be. And so this idea about what does Frank need now has been a really guiding question for me. It's really helped sharpen my thinking there. But that's not easy because I really like people, whether I agree with them or not, I really like them. So keeping that focus is a real challenge. What's next? Better, faster, so I really want better decisions at scale. And what does that mean? It means building the capability of New Zealanders to use frameworks to make better decisions. So this leads us to we're developing a digital product that helps people who give advice to decision makers structure that advice the same every time, so they can really focus on the content of the advice that they are giving, so that those decision makers are making, or if you're a decision maker, or if you're you're working for someone who you need to give advice to, that you can just cut to the chase of what you need to know. That's becoming fairly formulaic in terms of the how, so that the what can really shine through. And we'll be launching that product, beta testing it next week, in the next couple of weeks. And the view of that is so that it's not just it's not a services-based business now, better decision making. It's a product-based business that everybody can learn and use when they need it. And so that challenge for me then is, like all of us as founders, how much do I do and bootstrap on my own, and how much do I go and seek investment for, so we can do that even faster? Because I think the other part of it is that I have fallen into the trap in the past of paying for experts when I haven't been quite clear what that expertise is that I need. So there's a bit of a balance between when and how do you spend your investment, really. That's what's on my mind at the moment.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. And kia ora, Ihawa. Thank you, my friend. It's been a pretty rapid hour. So those of you who have to dash, really appreciate sharing your thoughts. Emily Mason, thank you for joining us, and thanks Territory 3 community for being with us.
Thanks, Don, for your ongoing support. You've always provided me with your perspective and a bit of a prod when I've needed it, so most appreciated.
Oh, it's more than a pleasure, and I've learnt a lot as well. So formally, we'll sort of end the webinar. So thanks to those of you who has to dash off, and we'll just whip to the remaining 4 questions. And John Frenich, thanks for your question. Do you think that the government should be more open to funding existing charities versus doing it themselves? Seems to me that there are a lot of effective charity organisations doing things really well with no public funding.
Good question, John. I do think the government isn't always clear about when it wants to be the service provider versus when it wants to contract for services. Yeah, so you see models, you see both models in the public service. And so I think, do I think government should be more opening to funding charities who are doing a great job? Yes, I do. Do I think there needs to be a framework around what a great job is and how much it costs to serve those the people that those charities are working with well? Yes, I also do. So I do think there's this kind of bit of middleware, it's probably the wrong word in a tech sense, but a middle layer that says, this is what we are doing. So the amazing thing about charities is they do the one thing they are doing really well. And then what government needs to do is compare all of those things and make a judgment about which ones when and how much. And there isn't that translation decision-making framework infrastructure in place at the moment that helps everybody understand how those decisions are made. Yeah, so to take a very pragmatic example, in the electricity sector, they separated out generation from supply from retail, from pipes to retail, and they publish their formula and consult on their formula for the weight adjusted cost of capital, right? We do not have any shared language or standards for what counts as value in the social sector that we understand as a sector. And I think until we have that, it's really hard for government to decide when and how it invests in particular charities. And it's really hard for particular charities to hone what they do to meet that need at a system level.
Yeah, thank you. Question from Erin. Hi, Emily. Curious about social impact initiatives that don't have financial models outside of partnerships and philanthropy. How do we continue to solve problems in this space if investors are not going to get financial gain back?
Curious about social impact initiatives that don't have financial models.
So I guess it's grants, entirely dependent on grants and donations would be my read of how that.
Yeah, is that right, Anna? Erin? So I think you need to work with so I often see impact described as a communications exercise rather than, or a case, a vignette rather than a scale solve. Yep. So if you are working with philanthropy or partnerships, demonstrating to them what is that impact. So what is that impact that they have in terms of the dollar values that is saved or generated for New Zealand, for society? You know, that's the reason they're investing. They're not investing for a dollar return to them personally. They're investing for a dollar return to New Zealand, or an impact for New Zealand. I think we should translate it into a dollar value. And that then lets us communicate, demonstrate, improve the value that we are creating through that investment. So Erin, I hope that answers your question. Do feel free to get in touch if you want to explore that a bit more.
Thank you. From Joe, and this is the second to last question. What are your hopes or fears for the introduction of more technology into the space of governance, where the public, rather than the public service, actually participates more fully in government or business?
I'm enthusiastic about this, Joe. I think this creates a very tight feedback loop in a way that government and governance doesn't often get, and I think it will help with those echo chambers that those of us who are making decisions can quite often find ourselves in, and hone what we are doing, because the purpose is to serve New Zealand better. And if we're seeking feedback on how we are doing that, that's an absolutely useful thing for technology to do. I hope that's what you mean. You know, the downside of the digital divide is real, you know, and we've really seen that under COVID, where those of us who have good internet, who have laptops, who have quiet spaces to work in our homes, you know, we can get on with that and be really productive. And those of us who, you know, live in bubbles of 18 people who share one laptop between all of them, you know, those who are using those public spaces to do their work can't do. That's a real risk. Yeah.
And the last question from Chris, and Chris, I think autocorrect might have served you poorly here. It says Bluebird Ventures, and there may be a Bluebird Ventures, but I think he might be referring to Blackbird Ventures, are looking for entities to demonstrate social impact as part of their pitch. So it looks like it's becoming table stakes for some VC. So it's more of a statement, I think, than a question. Right. But
good.
Totally
you can
agree.
do good and make money.
Yeah. Emily, thank you so much. Appreciate it, and apologies if the person that you're meant to be meeting with is on the call that you're slightly late. It's my fault. Thanks everyone who wanted to listen to those questions, and do encourage you to look out for our next webinar. Emily, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It was great fun.
Cheers. See you later.
Bye-bye.